So hello, Ray. You're in Calgary. I'm in Montreal. We have ourselves an election a lot earlier than everybody expected, I think. But nevertheless, we're into it, and for the next 11 weeks, we are going to be hearing nothing but election.
Although it's interesting, it seems like for the last 11 weeks we've heard nothing about election either. The election was going to be October the 19th. We all did know it. I think the dropping of the writ means it gets covered in a different way, and there are different rules about the finances. But for the rest, I think we've been in a election campaign for the better part of a few months already.
Yeah, and that was interesting. That was one of the things the Prime Minister said yesterday was we actually have been in an election campaign now. We just have to play by those rules you mentioned. But you wrote a really wonderful piece in the aftermath of another election that had the entire country buzzing, and that was the Alberta election in the spring. And you identified 10 things that you've seen over the course of your life and your engagement as someone who's a very, very close political watcher, and in fact, at one point in your life was a participant a direct participant in the political game as a campaign manager and as a candidate. So I think it'd be interesting to sort of take those 10 points over the next few weeks and just go through them and see how they bear out and how you're, I think you may be shifting a little bit around them, or whether we actually see some direct correspondences with them to have a good conversation over the next 10 weeks until election week. The one I was thinking of that I was struck by yesterday was in fact the point you made in the aftermath of the Alberta election, the election of Rachel Notley, that elections really, the electorate itself functions for most of them and most of the time in a state of disinterest and uninterest. They're disinterested in the sense that they're neutral. They're not the partisans that you and I rub shoulders with probably too much of our adult lives, but they're not those heavily engaged partisans, nor are they as interested as keeners like you and I might be. Bearing that in mind, how do we see an 11-week, and a historic 11-week campaign playing into that reality of an electorate that even in a more propitious time wouldn't be terribly interested in the middle or in the beginning of August?
I think there are two things to keep in mind for those who don't follow the ins and outs of political machines as carefully. First of all, election campaigns aren't really about convincing people about anything. All of the campaigns, to some extent, are spending their time with, we talk about the air war, which is the advertising campaign, and then we talk about the ground game, which is identifying people who either are likely to vote for you or are, or totally unlikely to vote for you. So basically, all of the parties have systems in which they are busy trying to identify name by name, household by household, who is of a disposition that is likely to vote for them on the defined ballot question. So they're not trying to convince you. They're trying to identify you and get things that will reinforce what you already think. That's at the one level for the vast majority of the population. Then there is that genuine undecided vote, and that group has been increasing. When I started in the political game some 25, 30 years ago, we probably went into election, the last week of an election with a very small percentage of vote undecided. Today, their estimates are that between 20 and 30% of voters actually make up their mind in the last weekend. So it really, and they make their mind up not by careful reading and engagement. They make it up based on impressions, which is why you're seeing all of these, Justin Trudeau, he's not up for the job. Stephen Harper is a one-man show that you don't like. Thomas Mulcair is Angry Tom. The parties are trying to, through advertising, put an impression in your head that is going to affect your emotions. Because when we listen to the news, we really look to have our biases confirmed. So the campaign actually is something quite different than most people think about. It's not really an engaged argument or conversation. It's actually about branding and voter identification.
But I wonder, Ray, is that a risky gambit then for a governing party, which ostensibly should be trying to sell its record and trying to sell the things that it's done since it's had a majority, and a prime minister who is constantly saddled with the image of someone who's distant, remote, and maybe doesn't even any longer care. I mean, you and I both know that's not necessarily true, but who is ultimately detached. To have to sustain that for 11 weeks, doesn't he really, and the Conservatives, don't they really run the biggest risk here?
I think they're running a huge risk. On the other hand, I don't think they have an alternative. The Conservatives have the most loyal but the smallest accessible vote in this election. There are more than half of Canadians who enter into this election that absolutely will not vote for the Conservatives no matter what happens. They know that. So they're not focused on them. They're focused on that smaller subset that has a possibility of voting, and they're entirely structuring their campaign around that accessible vote to them. Now, to some extent, the Liberals and the NDP are doing the same. They have a larger accessible vote. On the other hand, they have more votes and seats to gain. They need to gain because they're starting behind. At the end of the day, the most likely people to vote in the next election are the people who voted in the last election, and they need some reason to change their vote. So there is a power of incumbency, for the most part, that is there, that plays in the Conservative advantage. That only holds true until this mood of change comes, in which that sort of boomerangs on you and becomes the opposite. The Conservatives are going to play a very delicate game to try to make sure that doesn't happen during the next 11 weeks.
Let me ask you, as I mentioned, you've been a candidate, you've been a campaign manager, you know the actual physical rigor of being involved in a 5 or 6 week campaign, never mind an 11-week campaign. If the election is being fought really at that local level, almost sort of hand-to-hand combat, if I can use that metaphor, how do aspiring MPs pace themselves over the course of 11 weeks in order to physically be able to maintain what it is they have to do, but also to avoid, even among a local electorate, what we would say in sports, peaking too soon, because showing signs of strength, and then suddenly there's a gaffe or something goes wrong, or you just get tired. How do you do that? What are the things that MPs will be doing?
I think there's two things. First of all, the first several elections I was involved in the 80s, and we're 63 days long, the campaign. So it's suddenly, 77, yes, is longer than 63, but it's actually only since the 90s that the campaigns have become relatively shorter, of the 37-day variety. I think what's interesting is there's probably going to be a bigger expectation on local candidates to knock on more doors. With an 11-week campaign, there's less excuse for why have I not seen my candidate. So it will be interesting to see if that actually plays out. At a personal level, I think it really is a matter of structure and discipline with your team in terms of knowing what your message is, staying on your message. I think the interesting thing is going to be, with an 11-week campaign, the idea of some unforeseen event that no one is thinking about today that happens to land in the middle of the campaign, and to test the immediate response of people for which they're not prepared. It's twice as likely to happen in a campaign that's twice as long. And that will, I think, be very interesting at a local level, and you really can't prepare for that. and from a voter perspective, it may give us a better opportunity to measure our candidates and our leaders in terms of how they respond to something entirely unforeseen.
Care to just speculate, just take a guess, or offer an informed opinion on who that is most likely to happen to? Is it most likely to be the government that's going to face that?
Well, I think the government will obviously be tested in the sense that they not only have to respond politically, but they also have to, they may have to deal with something, some sort of a crisis in the middle of it, and they'll be judged accordingly. On the other hand, I think experience plays into that role, and I think, the fact that it's the Prime Minister's fourth campaign, or fifth actually, national campaign, and Mr. Mulcair and Mr. Trudeau are fighting their first national campaign, does probably mean that the experience of dealing with this on the fly, they may shine, but it is a challenge.
Unfair question is always the last question. Care to speculate, best guess, or informed opinion on what the results are going to be?
The campaigns, as I pointed out in that piece, the campaigns matter, so the narrative of the next 11 weeks are actually going to shape that result. Assuming nothing happens that differently than happened over the last year, if you take the current polls, we're looking at outcomes of 140, 120, 70, with the Conservatives and New Democrats on top of at the 140, 120, and it really will depend on who's each. I think the interesting consequence of that will be whether or not, let's assume for a moment it's a minority government, regardless of which stripe it is. The question then for the Liberals and the New Democrats is, do they hate each other or do more and not able to work together, or do they hate Stephen Harper more and are forced to work together? The question is, are we going to get a government, or are we actually going to get another campaign in which, through some sort of coalition and electoral reform, we basically extend this 11-week into the better part of a 2-year campaign as this minority government falls and we refight this all over within a relatively short period of time?
Well, we've got a whole bunch of summer and an awful lot of fall to see if that comes true, Ray. So we'll be checking in with you again. Thanks very much for all this.
You're most welcome.
Okay, talk to you soon.